This afternoon we have Danny Dorling, Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography, University of Oxford, who really hardly needs any introduction. Danny is, as most of you know, a prolific writer. I didn't know how prolific until I checked his CV before this plenary, and all I can say is I won't go through the numbers, but it's the kind of volume of production that would give most academics sleepless nights. His most recent work, People and Places, a 21st Century Atlas, the UK, with Bethany Thomas, which I'm reliably informed is available for £15 at Policy Press. And, I'm on commission for this. So. And a revised version of and updated version of Injustice, which is a £5. Okay, now, what I would say is, as far as I'm concerned, what's most important about one of the most important things about Danny's work, as well as its volume and its academic quality, is the fact that it has a wider purpose, and it reaches out beyond a purely academic audience, and also the subject matter. Because the core theme that runs through his work is identifying, exploring, and making explicit a lot of the inequities and injustices and social problems that afflict us in these, what we might say, are very troubled times. And these works, together with Danny's regular presentations and media engagement, have established him, I think it's fair to say, as a rare commodity in the UK, as a genuine, in every sense of the word, public intellectual. So it's my great privilege to present Danny Dorling.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to show you some maps because I'm a geographer, but before then I'll make a few claims. Some of these claims may appear to be extreme, but I don't think they are. The main claim is that demographically more has happened in the last 15 years in this country, or these four countries, than in the previous 50. If you worry about demography, old-fashioned demography, the kind of things you look at are fertility, mortality, migration, and marriage. I'll show you quite a lot about migration soon. Fertility, we now have an average age of first births which is over 30. People are delaying becoming parents as they have never done before. But most dramatically, mortality, you may have read in the press the last couple of days, and it was released first of all towards the end of January. Last year saw the biggest increase in deaths in England and Wales that has occurred at any point since the Second World War, albeit 1 year in the 1960s, which may be a year in which people were coming in to avoid migration controls. Mortality rose by about 5% last year. Mortality doesn't rise normally. In Scotland, the number of deaths rose by 8.5%. The minute I saw that, I thought it was huge. But the bigger shock, the thing I really cannot understand, is how the Chief Medical Officer of Scotland can produce a report on Scottish health which came out, I think, on January the 20th, and make no reference to the biggest increase in people dying in 1 year that there ever has been in Scotland. These are the reasons why I say more is happening in the last 15 years than in the last 50. I can moan. I think there are good reasons why we should moan, but I'm also going to try and be positive about things. I think most people think they know what a better politics would be. For most of us, it's my politics. If we only did what I said, everything would be fine. If we all did what you wanted, the world would be great. And of course, none of us actually know what a good politics would be. But one thing that drives me is, as I look at these numbers, and I've been obsessed by numbers for a very long time, you can't simply report the numbers. You do have to say, what can you do about them? What should you do? The Office for National Statistics yesterday produced a release saying that the rise in deaths in England was due to more dementia and the flu. But no reason why dementia should have suddenly risen. It's simply what is put on the death certificate. I'm also going to make claims about our politics having become extreme, and I use measures to show that, because it's very easy to say things are big, but if you measure it, it's more convincing. And last thing I should say, I'm going to show you a few cartoons. The cartoons were produced by Ella, very kindly, for a book called A Better Politics, which is available for free. You just type it into Google, and you can get a copy, because Ella did the cartoons for free. It costs somewhat more to produce the kind of maps I'm going to show you. And graphs like this. This is the work of Beth and Thomas. It took her a very long time. And another question, similar to that question about why do we have chief medical officers of our 4 countries if none of them are willing to say something has happened to public health? Why do we collect information at every census since 1841, and nobody produces a graph like this, as far as I can see, until Bethan did? This is the kind of graph you see all over the United States of America, where in the US they celebrate the fact that it's a melting pot nation and where people have come from. We don't do that in the UK. We are a very strange country. It's an absolute scale, so of course if you took into account that the fact the population has risen, it would alter somewhat. But it's showing you just how big the rise is, and from how many places. People are travelling much, much further than they used to travel before. What you're not seeing in this graph is the out-migration of people from the UK. We have enormous numbers of people still alive who've left this country and are living elsewhere. Depending on how the vote goes on June 23rd, we may get to meet quite a lot of them coming back in a rush. And they may be a bit surprised at what they find, and whether the health service that they're coming back in for can actually do what they think it will do. That's our incredible history. People involved in studying the censuses have been quite quiet about this as it rose. We were particularly quiet in 1991 when we got the first big rise in people mixing because of the hostility to it. But it gets to a point when you have to say, look, something quite incredible is happening. And you can make guesses as to why it continues to happen. The last time we had net high immigration during a recession was 1931, after the 1929 crash. When there's a global crash, the world is full of people looking for somewhere to go, and they're much more likely to come to a place which speaks their second language. These are the maps you're going to have to get used to if you're going to understand the other pictures I've got to show you. They stretch the country so that each part of the country gets the same amount of space as the number of people it has. Just a couple of graphs from The Guardian. Let's do a poll. Who doesn't read The Guardian? Put your hands up. No. I just wondered whether this could be the maximum Guardian reading conference. Anyway, so I'm doing well. I've got to laugh because this is an absolutely miserable graph, isn't it? There ain't no subtlety anymore. There's nothing subtle. Nothing subtle about the last budget. That's the handout. And the people producing the budget knew that this was what they were doing. This is the more complicated redistribution of money, I think produced by the IFS. Day after. The day before the budget, I was in the Treasury doing a talk to civil servants from the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. a similar number to you. And halfway through my talk, which was somewhat different from the talk I'm doing for you, I was talking about the housing crisis. I asked the audience to put up their hands. Let's try it with you. Put up your hands if you are renting, privately or social renting. Okay, now put your hands down and put up your hands if you haven't put your hand up. Right, so you either own our right to, okay. So a majority of you have got a mortgage or own outright, and a minority are renters. In the Treasury, the civil servants in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office, 2/3 of them put their hands up saying they were renting. And it suddenly crossed my mind, but I didn't say it, because this was 4 o'clock on the day before the budget. And this was a young 2/3 of the audience. To say to them, to ask the people who had a mortgage or owned a house to put their hands over their ears, and then to say to the 2/3 of the audience who were renting in London, now's your chance. Grab the person next to you who's got their hands over their ears, tie them up, put them in a broom cupboard. You've got 24 hours to rewrite the budget in your own interests. And again, I'm giving you too many questions rather than answers, but how can it be that we have a government that does things directly against the interests of the very people who are actually making the policies themselves, let alone everybody else? And how can it be that we have a government which produces lies that are such blatant lies that The Economist magazine feels obliged to point them out? The Prime Minister has repeatedly said that inequalities are falling, using the measure shown by the blue line here, which excludes the best off 9.99% of people, almost a whole of the best off tenth. And yes, if you exclude the best off tenth of the population, we are more than it together. The red line shows you a somewhat different pattern. I worry whether we have collectively become so innumerate that it is possible to do things which may have been harder to do in the past because the population had a better idea of numbers. But that may just be a cheap kind of justification for why you should look at numbers. My last graph, I think, before I show you some maps, and again, this is part of the claim for the extraordinariness of our times. This is the segregation index of the Conservative voters in Britain, shown since 1918. We've actually got the data back to the 1830s. Now what this is showing you, or the way I describe how you work out a segregation index, if you imagine, I won't do it, I was going to say, put up your hands if you did vote Conservative. Right. Imagine that 30% of you, whatever, 25% of you, which is how many did vote Conservative in May 2015, 25% of you voted Conservative, and you were all over there. We call it Surrey, okay? And now you have to imagine that I have a magic butter knife, and this magic butter knife, it's very large, is going to spread you lot evenly across the audience. What this statistic says is what proportion of you, the minimal proportion I would have to move to get an even spread of Conservative voters across the audience. So it's not about how well the party does in terms of winning, it's about how geographically concentrated their voters are. Now, from 1918, which was a khaki election and a very strange election, it was the last election in which the third party did best. The third party was Sinn Féin, and the third party got over 70 MPs in 1918. The election since then when the third party did best was 2015, when the SNP got 56 MPs. From that election onwards, Conservative voters became more evenly spread out across the country. The propensity to vote Conservative in very Tory areas, which were often very Protestant areas in Glasgow and the North West, fell. And the propensity to vote Conservative in areas which didn't, which were often Liberal areas, rose. And so by the 1950s and 60s, you had a pretty even spread of Tory voters everywhere, which wasn't great for the Tories, which is partly why they lost to Wilson in 64 and 66. Everything changed in 1974. Between the February and October in 1974, the southeast of England, the voters switched to the Tory party. And we saw it in the election result in October 1974. It's a little jump in the graph. The year after, the Conservatives anointed Margaret Thatcher as their leader in 75. Little drop down to 79, and then every election after 79, the segregation of the Conservative voters increased. So the areas where they were most popular saw more and more Conservatives, and the areas like Scotland where they were less popular saw fewer and fewer. The remarkable thing, I'll stop saying remarkable at this point, but is the last election, which saw the biggest jump ever in the segregation of the Conservatives. That jump up to surpass the 1918 maxima. It has nothing to do with Scotland, because there were practically no Conservative voters left in Scotland by 2010. So that rise has nothing to do with Scotland. That rise is increased popularity of the Conservatives in places like most of Oxfordshire, apart from Oxford East, and in the home counties. You think, how the hell did they win an election in May 2015? They won it by taking the seats from the Liberals who were trounced. And it was incredibly lucky for them to do it. But we've ended up with a country where you have never been less likely to meet somebody who doesn't vote like you vote, depending on where you live. So the country is becoming like this conference hall. If you live in a Labour area, or an area in which people don't vote, you'll meet other people who vote Labour or don't vote. If you live in an area where people vote Conservative, you are much, much more likely to meet other voters who vote Conservative, and that reinforces your views on both sides. And it also reinforces on the left to think, how can this be happening? It's happening because you don't talk to people who are in favour of it happening, and you don't know why there is such favour for quite a lot of what's going on amongst a minority of people. This is a map which was made up. Bethan and I made this up in the edition we did after 2001 census to try to describe, to summarise what we thought the 2001 census showed was happening as compared to 91 and earlier censuses. And it said the country is dividing into two halves. They look very much like the north-south divide, except you might as well call the bottom half London. Oxford, where I live, is an educational enclave of London. We have a bus to London. It costs £7 to get to London. We have London house prices. And the north and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland is a series of archipelagos, with the cities as islands in the middle of the archipelagos, surrounded by areas that are getting further and further away, that are becoming more peripheral. And I'm showing you that map because we then used that map this time, having defined it in 2003, to look at how things had changed in the last 10 years. Being positive. There are lots and lots of things that have got better that we tend not to notice have got better. Huge increases in young people getting to university. It is now fairly pointless paying for your child to go to a private school if you think that's going to help them get into a Russell Group university, because unless you're in the catchment of the worst comprehensive in your city, you might as well go state. Things like that have occurred that the population hasn't yet caught up on, hence private schools are still at 7% of the population. These two maps are showing you the geography of civil partnerships, which, as you might guess, is London and Brighton and so on. I see this kind of thing as positive because I can remember the 1991 census where the census form was corrected. If you were a man and you clicked that you're living with another man and you're cohabiting, they actually altered your answer to say that you were two single men. They didn't do it out of being malicious. I met, I think he's now dead, I met the man who made the decision to do it. He was gay and Jewish. They did it because they knew how the 1933 census had been used in Germany. And they thought it was dangerous to allow people to record that on their census form. Things have moved on so far that, if you can remember the census, we had 8 boxes to describe your relationship with your best beloved in the household. And this one is showing you areas which have had an increase in people who are married, which is only London. Marriage has been dropping in popularity for 40 years. In 1991, London was the only place in the country where a majority of working age people were not married. Then all over the place you get areas where a majority of people are not married. And suddenly we get a turnaround. And there's been lots of turnarounds in London. The other big turnaround has been, for years and years, London has sucked in a greater proportion of graduates. So our graduates increase up to, I think 2 million over 3 years. And every decade, a higher percentage of those graduates end up in London. So London's just jam-packed full of graduates. In 2011, for the first time, the number of graduates in the middle of London fell. So there are changes. The big change, though, is who's coming in from where. I'll go through these fairly quickly so I don't overrun. And these are graphs just showing you all we know since the census. We know remarkably little since 2011. Lots and lots of things have been cut. There was a proposal to cut the weekly death counts, and luckily they weren't. If they had cut them, we wouldn't know that we'd had the biggest rise in mortality. But this is what we know about numbers of people estimated to be in the country, born in other countries, and I'm only showing you to show huge variety, increases from many, many places. The biggest increase in immigration in the UK, though, to 2011, is the increased numbers of English who are now living in Wales and Scotland. That's the biggest immigrant group still in the country, because everybody's moving further. No increase in people born in Africa since 2011, and the map is showing you in the green areas in London actual decreases, because people are being pushed out of inner London. This is the increase in people of mixed ethnicity, 2012, 13, 14. Really rapid increase going on. You would be unusual now if in your wider family, your siblings, your nieces and nephews, your uncles and aunts, to be all white is now quite unusual as a family. But the biggest change in mixed ethnicity is again London. And you see it becomes a repetitive story about London and where we are at the moment in Birmingham, and then less change around, but it's changing. Sorry for the complication of the graph. This story was reported by others recently. Every single ethnic minority group and every group associated with immigration have all done incredibly well in British society to stereotype. You can, of course, say things are much more complicated than that, but when I was first studying these kind of things, there was a myth about 2 kinds of migrants. The myth was you had the Jewish migrants and the Hindu migrants, and they did well at education, and you had the Irish migrants and the Black Caribbean migrants, and they did badly. Turns out all the children of migrants do well, because children of migrants are children of people with get up and go, and because we are not as bad as the United States, despite all our problems. Okay, the last few graphs are going to just look at the southeast, because it gets too hard, I think, to see the whole country. So if you've got incredibly good eyesight, you can read the names. This is just a way to get you to buy the book, because it's so frustrating. That's where I now live. And so describing it, Oxford East is, and you can see how much I drank last night. Oxford East, of course, is the east side of there, and it's very different from the rest. Everywhere is touching where it should do, and everywhere is the size of the people who live there. Okay. The green areas are the areas with the highest increases in students to 2011. And so you're looking at Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, and a bit in London, But that was to 2011. Since 2011, and in particular since last year and the free market, anybody can go anywhere, we've had drops in northern universities and huge rises in Reading, Exeter, Bristol, Southampton. Reading booked out every hotel in the town for the numbers of extra students they got, and only charged the students £20 a night to stay in there. What you never hear is who's losing, but people are losing. But overall, look at that, the number of students keeps on rising, partly because what on earth else do you do when you are 18? It's a captive market, and it's good to go to university. And if you're a very imaginative 18-year-old, you may realise that there's no way the student debt is ever going to be repaid. Between us, try and keep this quiet, for June the 23rd, the biggest increase that there has been in students in our universities in England has been students from mainland Europe last 2 years. Huge increase. If it wasn't for the increase of students from mainland Europe who have a right to study here and a right to access a student loan, we would have actually had a fall. And if we have a fall in students, that means we have to sack people. Well, or reduce the salaries at the top of the universities, which is never seen as possible. So why have we had this huge increase in students coming from mainland Europe? Are they really attracted by our incredible marketing? Do they want to pay £9,000 a year? Or have they worked out that when they go back to France, which is the country sending most, or Romania, which is sending relatively high numbers but not absolutely high numbers, and they receive a letter, if it ever gets to them, asking to identify where they were living to pay the debt back, they don't reply to the letter? If you want to know why the student loan system isn't going to work, the European students is one of the reasons. But keep it quiet till after the 23rd of June. The other question you've got to ask is, why are our children not going to Europe? And I think we've made them more timid. It's not cheap, even though the courses are often free, but I think we've made them more timid. Just a few other things to show you things are changing. In general, there's been a big decrease in overworking. That's all the pink areas on the map, apart from central London, where it's increased again. The graph is showing you nationally the proportion of people who are working more than 45 hours a week. It's concentrated in financial industries, it's concentrated in London. Finance sacked people in the suburbs after the crash and brought them in to the middle, or kept the people who were in the middle and housed them working longer hours. There's all these kinds of things changing. This is a change in people with degrees. It's green because everywhere it's going up, particularly now in East London. That's Barking and Dagenham and so on. The light area in the centre and west of London is that lack of an increase in people with degrees. And of course, the number of degrees keeps on rising up to 2014, which is the latest data we have. This is people with no qualifications. And there's a big rise in the wealthiest part of London with people with no qualifications. This can include people with qualifications that can't be matched from countries overseas, but I suspect it also includes servants who have no qualifications. And we've seen a big increase in servants in the middle of London. The blue map is showing you the rise in education. There was a rise in education up to 2011. New Labour did spend money on some things. The dark areas show you Cambridge and Oxford and part of central London taking more than their fair share, which is why the house prices are so high now. And that's a fall in jobs since 2012 in education. The education budget is supposed to be ring-fenced. It's only ring-fenced up to age 16. So if any of you have got a child in the sixth form, you'll know how fast it's being cut. And here's the financiers and bankers, and that increase in central London, and decrease around here. Decrease in the people who used to go in on a train reading the Telegraph and working out how to do those strange shares that mean you don't have to pay tax. Those kind of people have now died, and there's a new kind of person. Other things, and a lot of this is predictable the minute you see it, but if I were to take more time and to ask you to predict it, it might be harder. This is the increase in families sharing houses again. And it's in the suburbs of London that you're getting 2 families now sharing a house, and the increase in that. And that's the increase since 2011 in proportion. It's still only less than 3% of families, there's 2 families to a house, but it's something we thought we'd got away from, and we're seeing it coming back again. This is my hobby horse, which is rooms and housing. All the blue areas, which is most of England, have seen an increase in the number of rooms per person. Nationally, we've had an increase in the number of rooms per person. We have more housing than we have ever had. We have built more housing, not as separate houses or flats, but as rooms in the attic, rooms underneath, extensions. We actually have been building, but we've also been sharing out what we've been building worse and worse and worse each year. This, I'm sorry for the title going, this is the mean age of, you shouldn't say percent, it's the mean age of mothers giving birth, which is now over 30. People are delaying having families, may never have a family, partly because of what's happening with housing. There's also evidence, this map is of the increase in illness. There was an increase in illness between the censuses up to 2011, and this graph is showing you the fall in people who are satisfied with their health. There was a big reduction in people being satisfied with their health after May 2010, and it includes people who were disabled and people who are going to be sanctioned and who were sanctioned. It's slightly like that 1974 thing, that the population is often ahead of policy and is affected by it. And here's the biggest change of all. There's been a doubling of the number of people in private rented accommodation, 2001 to 2011. 5.1 million to 10.1 million, with the biggest increase being in East London. London is currently going up 1% a year, private renting. It's landlords who are buying the property. That's the national increase, the speed at which it's happening. It is quite staggering, the speed of the takeover of property by people who are going to make a lot of money simply by charging for it and not doing much to the property. I promised you some graphs using that particular map that divides Britain into those 12 areas. So the point of this was that we defined the areas now 13 years ago, so it's objective, we didn't fix it, and you see population change, of course, has been concentrated in London, particularly central London. Huge increase in population change then. The archipelago centre, that rise, that's universities. That's Sheffield, that's Manchester, that's Liverpool. That's why there's little increase, but it's dwarfed by what has happened in London. And some little bit of politics to end on over what I think is happening. I think we are seeing a change in Britain which is deliberate. It's a change to a particular 1980s fantasy. And the 1980s fantasy is that a few people are very able, most people are not able. If you strive and work hard, you should be allowed to own your house, but if you don't, you should have to pay a rent. And if you can't afford to live in somewhere like London, you should get out. And those who work very hard should be well rewarded. It was a fantasy I was familiar with as a teenager in the 1980s. I didn't happen to hold this fantasy, but I knew people who did, and these were teenagers who loved the Thatcher government in the 1980s. And it's as if that group of teenagers have been waiting a very long time and have finally got to enact policies that they think are good. One thing, this isn't what you now see in Oxford, that estate agents put up after they sell a house, in most cases to a landlord. majority of buyers are now landlords. One thing I learnt recently, this was actually in the Treasury at that meeting, and I kicked myself for not realising it. Somebody said to me, don't you realise that it's good if house prices are high because it's a sign of success? And this is part of the problem about us living in separate silos. The thinking goes like this. The successful part of the city, the part you may have grown up in, or the little dormitory village you grew up in, was very expensive. It was very expensive because it's where the good people lived, who'd strived and worked hard and deserved their money. And the fact that you grew up in an expensive area is a sign that you and your parents are good people, and the higher the house prices in that area go, the better. And internationally, the city that's winning internationally is the most expensive city. It shows that economically it's doing well. So house prices rising in London are a good thing, and the market will sort everything out. But we might need some intervention. So the kind of intervention we'll have is the biggest spending at every budget since 2010, which is Help to Buy, massive underwriting of property, just to make sure the market does the right thing and the prices keep on rising in London, because that's a good thing. And the latest increase is that if you are London-based and somehow you can scrape together 5% of a mortgage and you can find a flat in Hoxton for less than 600,000, it might even have 2 bedrooms if you're lucky. That's the people in the UK, will lend you 40% of its value as a government mortgage. I told this to an audience in Scotland, fairly left-wing audience in Scotland, fairly old, fairly middle class. None of them knew that they were lending money to people in London to buy houses. But it makes sense to have this policy if you think it's good to have very expensive house prices in places like Oxford and London. And I think I've certainly failed to realise it's not a conspiracy. I just find it hard to get my head into that way of thinking that says this is okay. And I think we need to do more of that. I've shown you a whole load of pictures of different things, many of which appear not to be connected, but they all are connected. It's when you see the same patterns happening again and again, who can work in what job, what qualifications people have, whether there's increase or decreases in segregation, the whole lot is connected. My favourite comment isn't the Lenin quote, it's George Monbiot's wonderful article about the importance of whale poo in the oceans, and why if we kill all the whales, we're in trouble. So what to do? I don't think it helps to get that bitter, but it's quite hard not to be bitter at some of the things that you see. I think it's good to try to understand what's gone on and to understand where those people are coming from who think it's okay if you have a falling life expectancy, because that's simply accelerating the deaths of people who might otherwise cost you quite a lot in your healthcare system. I think you have to not condemn them, but help them understand that most of them will grow old, and when they are old, the last 10 years of their life, no matter how wealthy they are, will not be particularly enjoyable if the country carries on moving in the way it is. So that's talking about being kind to the rich and the affluent in their own self-interest. Please quiz me about things you don't agree with or things you agree with, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Danny, for an inspiring if troubling presentation. We'll take questions now. People could wait till they're handed a microphone and I'll take questions. Up here.
Hi, I'm Helen Kennedy from Sheffield. I thought that was great, especially great if you like numbers and graphs. I was interested in your comment about people becoming more enumerate. I don't know if that was speculation, if there's any research about that, any evidence, any numbers about that.
I'll do that one quickly. Yes, there is some. I'm obsessed by numbers. The OECD do a survey of people's ability at numeracy, problem solving and literacy at age 15 and age 16 to 24 across countries. If you look at the richest 25 countries, we and the United States are pretty bad at age 15, 16. But what's fascinating, I wish I brought the graph, if you look at up to age 24 and our ability on the basic maths test, we're right at the bottom of the US. So we're teaching maths in a way that gets a child to get an A rather than a B at GCSE or a C rather than a D, but not to learn maths. However, having said that, there is other evidence from Flynn that shows that each generation of people over a whole generation is becoming remarkably more numerate and logical. So in the long term, we're becoming better and better at visual thinking and worse at doing things like knowing how to plant a potato. I mean, it's a zero-sum game. So long term is a good message about our ability. In the short term, we've become very, very bad, and we are the worst at maths in the whole of Europe, particularly by age 24. And because of an obsession about passing a test on a particular day, and a lack of understanding by Michael Gove about what education is. It's not about getting a high test result on a particular day, which is what Michael Gove was good at.
Graham Crowe.
Thank you. Just to follow on from that, I wonder if you could kind of extend the point about being good at maths to being able to analyse an argument. On the radio recently, there was someone interviewed about the changes to buy-to-let arrangements in the budget. And this woman, who was a buy-to-let person, but also a financial journalist, said that it was because of buy-to-let that inner city areas have been rejuvenated. That was the kind of causal effect account that she was presenting.
Yeah.
And I spoke to the radio at the time and said that I thought it was more complicated than that. Yeah. But I was surprised that the interviewer didn't kind of pick her up on that. But it's not just about being good at maths, it's also about the interpretation and the development of arguments and so on. Yeah. And so I suppose I'm really interested in having thoughts about how we might improve not just numeracy, but also kind of that broader literacy around understanding the sorts of things that social scientists try to do when they're addressing issues around population.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a tricky question. And it depends where you're coming from. I've done some work with medics and epidemiologists who have a particular view about causation, which is you really do need to think you know what's going on, and you need a dose-response relationship. You need to give the medicine in increasing doses with nobody knowing that's what you're doing, so fairly unethically, and watch the result actually rise. And that is the only way to be fairly sure. But working with them, you can see the way you go through other possibilities. So you could far better say that the increase in flats in inner cities has been due to immigration. And if it wasn't for immigration, we'd have never built these flats because we would have never had increased pressure on our housing stock. We'd have been like Germany until Germany's recent good fortune to get 1 million highly skilled middle class people and their children in. Germany was demolishing property after property in shrinking cities. If we hadn't had an increasing population, that's what would have been happening to the middle of Bradford, the middle of Leeds, the middle of Sheffield. And that is what was happening up to around about 1995. In the 1990s, 15% of the entire housing stock of Glasgow was demolished, a sixth of a city in just a decade. Buy-to-let landlords just alter who finances the building and just how shoddy the jerry-built flats are. And it's well worth looking at them. They are not well built, these flats in the middle of our cities. They're built to maximise short-term profit.
Question over here.
Simon Smith from Charles University in Prague. I was interested in your electoral geography graphs and startled by the finding that you're less likely than ever to meet someone in your constituency who are different from you. Yeah. You said that not due to Scotland in the last election, you didn't offer an explanation. How much of that could be explained though by tactical voting? Yeah. How different would those graphs look if you took into account lifetime patterns of voting? Or elections that use a different electoral system, for example, have you tried calculating this for European elections with a more proportion?
These are all good ideas. Norman Tebbit complained that I hadn't calculated it for the Labour Party on the own. Tactical voting should certainly increase it a bit, but it shouldn't carry on and on increasing it. And tactical voting only really came in when the Liberals started doing well and the SNP after 1983. Lifetime is interesting. Whether we're seeing Conservative voters migrate to economically successful areas or become Conservative when they arrive there, I think you get assimilation occurring. So if you take Oxford East looks like a Durham pit village politically. It's 50% Labour vote. It's risen in the last two elections, while all around the Conservative vote rises. So to fit in socially in Oxford East, it helps if you vote Labour. And Oxford East is fairly posh. The tactical voting is that people don't vote Green in general elections in Oxford East, despite the fact they vote Green in local elections. But I should look more. We have a ridiculous voting system. Just 25% of the electorate secured a Conservative majority. Labour keep quiet because in 2005 they secured a majority with just 20% of the electorate. The only country I found in the world that's worse is Colombia, where the president once got in on 18%. Even in the US, you need a higher proportion. So it is truly, truly odd. There is a hope that Labour will put PR into their manifesto. The Shadow Chancellor's promised it. It's possible. And that's what it takes, is for one of the main parties to actually want it and put it in a manifesto.
Question? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Louise Ryan from Middlesex University. Because when you were talking about the fact that they were destroying housing a few years back in the 1990s, it reminded me that in London in the 1990s they were closing down schools. And there were lots of schools that were closed down because they didn't have enough children for the schools. And now, of course, they don't have enough schools for the children in London. And I'm wondering, it's something that's often puzzled me, to what extent politicians are just fundamentally short-sighted, that they get stuck in the moment, that they can't. It's to use that horrible hackneyed phrase, a lack of joined-up thinking. And I was very struck by your story about the civil servants, where they were actually kind of shooting themselves in the foot, actually, as you described, when they were renters themselves. I'm wondering, to what extent is it a deliberate ideology? Are they actually doing this on purpose? Yeah. Or are they in some ways just so naive and sort of very short-sighted because of people like David Cameron? Their lives are sort of so different from the rest of ours that they genuinely cannot see the long-term consequences. So to what extent do you think it's deliberate, or is it just their worldview?
My view is that the majority of it is their worldview. I think there are a very small number of individuals at the top of politics who might be dangerous, but and actually take pleasure in people suffering. But I think it's a tiny number. I think generally most politicians, including on the right, want to be remembered for having done good. And there is an ethos, a very strong belief in the Conservative Party that planning is bad. So just a year before the 2011 census, the Cabinet Office tried to cancel it, and then found, luckily, that they couldn't, because the cost of cancelling it would have been greater than the cost of carrying on with it. But they don't want numbers collected because it only encourages people like me to suggest that you can plan. And the danger is, as soon as you have that, you get socialism. So Harold Wilson loves the census. He funded the biggest one ever in 1971. They believe that planning stifles creativity. So one argument for the census is we need a census to tell us where to build new schools. The census could easily be cancelled in 2019 if there's no Census Act. The current policy on schools is you should only get a new school if you can get together with your friends and neighbours and start one yourself. When every school, as in Oxfordshire, becomes an academy, every secondary is an academy, the local authority no longer has the ability to plan schools. And in areas of population change, this has the biggest effect. But they honestly and sincerely believe that we would get a better world with less planning. They really do. And also believe that what I'm calling schools are charity. This is education for those who are not clever enough to work hard enough to get enough money to buy a decent education. This is charity education for the 93%. And it's different. And you wouldn't send your own child there unless you had to for the political purposes, in which case you'd find a state school that looked rather like a private school. When the irony in this, I don't want to be pessimistic, the incredible irony is schools from which only 2% of children went to university when I was a child are now sending 50% to university. These are bog standard comprehensives. The majority of young women, majority of girls in England are going to university. It is no longer a middle class thing. London, of course, has seen the biggest improvement in GCSEs, and that's mostly down to immigration, a little bit of London Challenge money, a bit of the teachers. But mainly, there's nothing better than getting the children of immigrants into an area to improve the schools. So there's just a lot of naivety. David Cameron's letter to the head of Oxfordshire County Council, the one his mother and his aunt criticised, shows just a simple lack of understanding. Which is why I think you've got to be kind. He doesn't want to come over as stupid. He's divested himself of almost all of his shares, and then finds he can't do anything right. But it's not his fault. No.
He's more to be pitied.
Yeah. Well, not pity, but understanding how. And we'll be making it. I will be saying things some things that will be very stupid. Particularly likely here because I'm amongst friends, so I'm not being challenged. And what you really need is to be challenged on your core beliefs and for people to point out things you hadn't thought of. That, to get back to your question on causation and how you test things, the best way is arguing with people who don't believe what you think the cause is, and that really, really helps.
Yeah. Other questions? In the front here.
Thanks very much. I want to ask a question about young people. My impression is that there are statistics to show that the young are really doing worse at the moment. And I mean, just from my own children who've all been to university and had a middle class background, the erosion of employment rights is really shocking. So, I can't imagine what it must be like for people who haven't had those advantages.
Yeah.
From being fired on the day for a teaching assistant who expected to work 2 weeks without pay in a hotel, or even if you work for a charity, having to go without sick pay and holiday pay. So I wonder what, and I think you have published on it, so I was surprised it wasn't.
I haven't said. I've published on the mental health of the young, which is getting worse. But I've been surprised not to find other evidence of things getting worse. So we haven't had, we haven't had a big rise in drug use, particularly heroin use amongst the young again. We have had a rise in heroin use amongst people in their 30s and 40s, and deaths, but not amongst the young, and that's what we got in the 80s. We haven't had a big rise in youth suicides. One thing that has happened is that parents are now protecting their young far more than they used to. They are keeping them in the house, letting them stay, not kicking them out, which used to happen. 500,000 young people are given £10 a day, or the equivalent, by their parents, so they don't have to sign on, so they're not on JSA, and they can put on their CV that they're doing their own internet startup or something. But we're becoming more European in how we treat our young. I think part of what the government is doing is almost moving the age of childhood up to 25, the age of majority. Now, until you're 25, you're not treated as an adult when it comes to minimum income and so on. And obviously that's insulting. On the other hand, we're having another change. So I'm confused about the young. When I'm confused, I try and keep quiet, so I should do, about things. I don't know why there hasn't been more trouble. I don't know why there haven't been more riots. I do wonder whether young people, remember we've got our first 3 years worth of people paying the full fees now. By 2020 we'll have 8 years worth of students with these massive debts, average of 56,000. I do wonder whether collectively this group have begun to work out that they actually are all in it together, and eventually when they don't buy our houses and when they don't do what we want, as we get frail and old, they're going to win. They've got time on their side. And a few of them may become rich, but not very many. The bulk of young people who are going to be very lowly paid, are going to have massive debts, are going to be paying rent, in theory for the rest of their lives, will not be able to start a family in their 30s. But you can't, I've never seen a case where you've managed to push that for that long. But I'm confused, but and no riots. No riots is really interesting, unless we've had really successful application of D notices. So people have tried to start riots, and they're not reported. So you have incredible lack of riots since 2011 compared to the past.
Seems a rather depressing, that's the only indicator.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Segregation, you talked about what are the opportunities for engaging with kindness with those rich people that are behind their gates and gated communities, etc. What are the opportunities for kindness?
People do meet. They often meet in strange circumstances, so somebody who cleans their house will come from a different background to them and so on. It's whether you condemn or whether you're kind and say this isn't good, but in a way that doesn't condemn. If you condemn, the shutters go down. I'm a hard-working person, my dad worked really hard for that, you'll just squander it. All of that comes up. If you're more calm about it, then the instant hostility to, in effect, saying, really, it would be a good idea if you didn't have all the money. It doesn't, doesn't rise so quickly. And the other reason for advocating kindness is that the far right find kindness almost impossible because they lack empathy, and they can't do it. They believe a kind world would be a terrible world. It would be economically bad. We need people to be selfish, we need them to be greedy, we need them to be tough, we need to chuck people out of houses they can't afford to live in, we need to make them go and live in Stoke and Liverpool. We need to have children drowning in the Mediterranean with our gunships there to teach a lesson. they can't do kindness, which is another good reason for doing kindness.
Daniela San from the University of Strathclyde, and I'm a big fan. We always appreciate your time to Scotland. You mentioned Scotland a couple of times in your presentation, and the issue of inequality was a big part of the debate we had in Scotland around issues of independence. And just now, referring to the election, and despite the fact that it was an issue, and it's been an issue for the last decade, and so on, since the SNP has more or less been in power, they haven't managed to address or tackle inequality. So, just a general comment on what do you think it would take to
in Scotland?
A revolution, not just in Scotland, in the UK overall. I would just mention Scotland because it's been an obvious issue as just at the forefront of the agenda, the political agenda, tackle inequality in a different way than the UK is doing. So, what would it take? Is it a revolution? When will people have enough?
When will they have enough?
In the UK of inequality?
In little ways, Scotland is getting some hits. So educational inequality is falling. Access to university is actually widening in Scotland quietly, and not in England and Wales. What it's taken in the past has tended to be an economic shock. So countries losing wars, Japan and Germany became very equal. The most likely way to become more equal is an economic shock. But we're at a peak. We are the most unequal rich country, we're the most unequal country in Europe, including the poor countries of Europe. And we're set in 10 years to become the most unequal country in the OECD. And when you are the most unequal, there's only one way to go. So small things might change. But I happen to think the most likely thing is an economic shock. And in the aftermath of a shock, you can't take another £80 billion off the poorest because it just isn't there. You'll have to do a land tax, a wealth tax. Things will become necessary no matter who's in power. But you can't predict what the shock will be. I can give you lots. If 5.5% of people had said yes rather than no, that would have been enough of a shock. The pound would have crashed the next day. That came very close. The referendum on the 23rd, well, I'd love people to vote to stay in, but if people vote to stay out, that's the economic shock. Or somebody leaking the tax affairs of rich people, and suddenly buying property in London as a way to hide your assets doesn't work anymore. So just watch house prices in 4 weeks and 8 weeks' time. And they might say it's the end of some of the tax benefits to buy-to-let landlords, but I suspect no longer be able to hide your money in London with anonymity could be it.
We've got time for just maybe two very, very quick questions. One up here and one down here.
Thank you. I'm Louise from Margaret University. I've also got a question about kindness because it seems like the problems and patterns you were describing are mostly articulated in political.
Sorry, say again. Can you repeat that? Sorry.
It seems like the problems and patterns that you were describing were mostly articulated in political and economic terms, but your concluding slide here seems to be appealing to interpersonal, even emotional responses. So I kind of wanted to ask about what you think about the relationship between those two realms in relation to social change, because I think the imperative to be calm and be kind sometimes falls on the relatively powerless.
Yeah.
Right? And can contribute to maintaining the quality that you described.
I don't think when I write and talk, I'm hardly ever talking to the relatively powerless. So that's partly why if I was in the relatively powerless, I would burgle, which is what people did in the 1980s. And again, I can't understand why people are not burgling. So I always think I'm talking to people who are fairly powerful and saying it might be better, rather than to condemn outright, to say you too will have quite a bad life, even though you've got a lot of money. Your children will be segregated in the way they're not segregated in any other European country. you'll be forced to live in an area of town that you think is safe. You know, just explaining what is bad about this for the pretty affluent, I think would be helpful, rather than saying you're a bunch of immoral people who are just killing people, which you could make that case for, but they are not generally choosing to do this. But in Scotland, you know, you've got to ask, how can deaths rise 8.5% in 1 year in Scotland and nobody say anything about it? And it really wasn't the flu. You know, we've got numerous lab reports now about the flu.
Okay, one final very quick question.
Okay, so you had multiculturalism in your title.
Yes.
One of your first graphs was about the increasingly diverse population. You've all been thinking about offshore wealth, the vestiges of empire, but your story was very bounded in terms of geography within this sort of island mentality. I mean, are there ways in which we need to think of these stories in a broader frame in terms of the legacies of empire, connections to other places, the transnational and the global, which is the theme of this conference?
Yeah, thank you. And you've helped me a lot, Anne, because this is what I forgot to say in the talk. One thing I think is going on, and that's why I put multicultural in the title, is I think we're in the last stages of coping with the fact that we no longer have an empire. And we're in the final stage of adjusting to that. And there's a group of people who hate the fact we no longer have an empire and want Britain to be great again, and think if we just leave the European Union, that's what's been holding us back. And also these horrible planners have been holding us back. And if we let our top cornflakes rise to the top with nothing to control them, to stop them, we will become the richest place on the planet again. It's the last kind of dying kick of empire that we're seeing. And if you see things like that, it is possible to be far more optimistic than you might otherwise be. I'll give you one last stat, just to end with, which makes me optimistic. The richest place on the planet before Earth, the place with the largest mini-empire, was the United Provinces in what is now the Netherlands. Amsterdam was the richest city before London. House prices in real terms on that posh street with the canal in Amsterdam peaked in 1675, and then they fell for 300 years. And that makes me glad. That's okay.